Hello, good evening. My name is John Cunningham, and on behalf of the Committee of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'll be your chair this evening, and I'll be dealing with questions and so on later on. I should say at the outset that if you want to engage with us, if you want to have a question for the speaker, that you use the Q&A function. So with that out of the way, I'd like to first thank the Moore Institute for hosting this evening, as it has done with the Society during the pandemic period on a number of occasions. So thanks to Dan Carey and to David Kelly for that. So I'm going straight over to introduce our speaker, Andrew Femister, who'll be talking to us about Irish boycotting in the late 19th century. Impacts and interpretations is the topic. So Andrew is currently an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow based in the Moore Institute at NUI Galway, and he's been working on the history of the land war and on broader transatlantic radicalism during the 19th and early 20th centuries. He has a book which is imminent from Cambridge University Press. The title is Land and Liberalism, Henry George and the Irish Land War. Andrew has moved on from that to work on a history of boycotting. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to our speaker, and Dr. Andrew Femister.
Right, thanks very much, John, for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak. Also, thanks to Dan Carey and David Kelly as well. So, as John mentioned, boycotting in late 19th century Ireland. So I'm going to talk this evening about the reception and the reaction to boycotting as it emerged in Ireland during the Land War, both in terms of the immediate governmental reaction, and through this, looking at the broader impact that the practice had on systems and theories of governance as well. So as John mentioned, my current research looks at the political and intellectual impact of boycotting as it spread out from the west of Ireland during the 1880s. And in general, I'm interested in how it intersected with ideas about democracy and political participation, as well as assumptions about ethnic identity and cultural behaviours. But right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the legal and political responses to boycotting in Ireland, and how the government in London and Dublin went about dealing with the problem, but also how they thought about it and how that influenced political thinking more broadly. In the first place, it's worth probably giving a little bit of background, even though I imagine it's something that most people will be very familiar with. As a term, of course, and indeed as a specifically named practice, it emerged in the wake of the ostracism of Captain Boycott, a story which probably doesn't need retelling here. Social ostracism is in one sense a nearly universal practice in all human societies, especially prevalent in agrarian settings with strong local ties and local knowledge that makes it most effective. As a result, the British government had long associated these forms of social exclusion with Ireland in particular. So for instance, during the Welsh Rebecca riots in the early 19th century, one local police report on the disturbances noted that, quote, "The right which is thus arrogated of judging another man's domestic conduct is characteristic of a rude state of society and threatens to undermine the operation of the laws of the land," before adding for emphasis that the principle is perfectly Irish. The government in Ireland had long paid close attention to what it considered to be intimidation, although prior to 1869, official police statistics did not distinguish between threatening notices and other forms of intimidation. So boycotting, before it was named as such, was a key part of the Land League's strategy right from the beginning of the Land War, just as it had formed part of the tactical arsenal of early agrarian movements as well. What was novel about it was both the level of organisation and the scope of the ambitions of those who engaged in it. Parnell's famous speech at Ennis just 4 days before the Captain Boycott affair laid out the ways in which social ostracism should be explicitly uncoupled from threats of violence that had usually accompanied it before. His encouragement to leave transgressors, quote, severely alone, placed a high value on non-violence, which was to become the hallmark of claims made in defense of boycotting. And this explicit rejection of violence is perhaps the key distinguishing feature of boycotting as a named practice, as distinct from other forms of social ostracism practiced before. And this, as numerous speeches on Land League platforms made clear, was exactly where its power came from. The question of violence, therefore, was highly contested, as it appeared to hold the key to the legitimacy of the practice. Prosecution without violence was very much more difficult, especially in the US when the practice traveled there. So critics were invested in seeing the boycott as being, as the Chief Secretary explained, enforceable only by the bullet of the assassin or the torch of the incendiary. So two things happened very quickly in the aftermath of the Captain Boycott affair. Over the winter of 1880 and through the spring of 1881, both the term and the practice of the boycott spread rapidly. Initially throughout Ireland, where at public meetings across the country, attendees were encouraged, quote, to follow the example set to all Ireland by the brave men of Ballinrobe. Boycotting then spread to Britain, and especially the cities of Glasgow and Liverpool, where in December of 1880, reports emerged of Irish communities boycotting, quote, those of their countrymen who withhold support from the Land League. The police's crime statistics show this rapid development. There's a significant rise in all forms of crime between 1877 through to the height of the Land War in 1881. But the most commonly reported crime, and the one with the most statistically dramatic increase, is that of intimidation. In 1877, there were 81 instances of threatening letters or notices across the whole of Ireland, and 18 counts of other forms of intimidation. And by 1881, this had risen to 2,191 letters and 475 instances of intimidation. County Galway saw a total of 9 combined instances of intimidation in 1878 and 302 in 1881. The dramatic rise in these intimidation cases in the other category, i.e. not threatening letters, can be seen in the monthly returns for 1880. So immediately after Parnell's speech and Captain Boycott's issues, there is a large rise in other forms of intimidation, i.e. boycotting. And on the 13th of December, Gladstone described worriedly in his weekly missives to Queen Victoria, quote, the increasing offences, especially of what may be called violent intimidation, and the increasing disposition of the people over a widening area to give way to the pressure of the Land League and join its ranks. However, he added, the only redeeming feature of this development was that, quote, offences affecting life do not increase. This proliferation was mirrored by the word itself, which had already begun to lose its scare quotes by the beginning of 1881. James Redpath, the Scottish-American journalist who had been covering the initial boycott in Mayo, and who indeed claimed to have coined the term himself, spoke in January in 1881 at the Cooper Union in New York, and again at the Masonic Temple in Washington, D.C., on, quote, the Irish land war and boycotting. The next month, in February 1881, the United Weavers of Fall River, Massachusetts, declared a boycott on local grocers who had not extended credit to the striking workers. And in April, several papers observed that the Irish in New York had now imported the practice wholesale, warning that such old world methods were at odds with our free and American system of labor, and counseling adherence to the American spirit of reason and rationality over tyranny and superstition. By the summer, several large-scale boycotts were in operation in New York. Speaking in support of striking brewers at New York's Cooper Union, in June of that year, the Irish-American labor organizer, Robert Blissett, told the crowd that, quote, the boycotting movement would assume such proportions so as to drive the striking brewers to victory. And during the 1880s, at least prior to legislative developments in the next decade, boycotting became, in the words of one American observer, the most powerful weapon that labor had ever wielded. But before moving on to look at the mechanisms and the avenues taken to restrict the practice, it might be useful to look at one particularly notable case of boycotting, one that did a great deal to set the terms of the subsequent debate. This particular case occurred shortly after the initial Captain Boycott affair and involved a Cork landlord called William Bence Jones. Not particularly well known now, he received a large share of public attention at the time. He was born in Suffolk, educated at Harrow and Oxford. Bence Jones was a London lawyer before inheriting his Irish estate in Cork. And he saw his role there as an improver, primarily by, in his own words, encouraging, quote, a process of natural selection in which the tenant's own qualities, good or bad, were made the cause of the survival of the fittest. Trusting the natural providence of the market, he rejected the idea of peasant proprietorship as belonging to, quote, simpler stage of civilization. Blessed with an ability to see only his own virtues, for him the Irish problem was what he called a moral difficulty, a collective weakness of will and infirmity of mind. Seeing the removal of tenants as equivalent with improvement, he eliminated subdivision, whereby multiple tenants might be mutually liable under a single lease, in order to, quote, give a better chance for exertion to the good ones. By offering land from evicted tenants to the remaining ones, Bence-Jones consolidated the farms on his estate, with the added advantage to him of extinguishing solidarity among the farmers. For when a tenant was struggling to pay his rent, quote, all hoped to gain by his misfortune, and he met with no sympathy. Through this method, the number of farms on just one of his 5 farmlands was reduced from 26 to 4. As his rent collection day approached on the 7th of December 1880, rumours had already circulated that his tenants wouldn't pay their rents. But despite numerous evictions that he'd enforced and all the evidence to the contrary, Bence-Jones was convinced both of the wealth of his tenants and his scrupulous fairness as a landlord. As such, he maintained that his tenants were very keen to pay their rents, but were prevented from doing so by threats from the League. The next week, Bence-Jones sent his cattle to be shipped from Cork, but when several other graziers noticed who owned them, they protested to the director of the shipping company that they would cease to deal with them if Bence-Jones's cattle were carried on the shipping line. Subsequently, the 2 drovers who had taken the cattle to be shipped discovered who they belonged to and, quote, declined to have anything more to do with them, as the newspaper reported. And so the bullocks commenced wandering first upon the quay and then into Bridge Street and King Street, until they were finally rounded up by the police. The next part of the saga, they were put onto a Dublin train and ended up there. But that wasn't the end of Bence-Jones's problems. After 2 days on the quays of Dublin, Bence-Jones finally found some transport for them, but upon their arrival in Liverpool, dock workers refused to handle them, nor could a buyer be found for them in the city. They were eventually transferred to Manchester and taken by a butcher there. This was the extensive reach of the boycott. Meat labelled Bence-Jones's beef could be found being sold in London's markets days later. Such was the widespread notoriety of the episode. Several notable aspects, I think, arise from the story of William Bence-Jones. In the first instance, it demonstrates the extent and the spatial reach of boycotting, even in its first few months. The resistance of others to become associated with Bence-Jones in any way highlights just how untouchable people could become within a specific community. But the selling of Bence-Jones's beef, for instance, also highlights that the social and spatial limitations of a boycott and how restricted it was to those who shared a political or a collective identity of some kind. Perhaps the most important thing about the whole affair in the end was Bence-Jones's hastily published book on the boycott. Full of cant and pharisaic self-complacency, according to T.P. O'Connor, the book would help shape British public opinion of the boycott in Ireland as a reign of terror, as Bence-Jones described it, inflicted on a weak-willed peasantry in the name of red republicanism. Bence-Jones had argued in this book that his difficulties in selling his cows meant that, quote, all the rights of property, as hitherto understood, are in the balance, and claimed that the boycott was only made possible by an absence of freedom and independent thought in the country. The purpose of his book, as he expressly noted, was to remind, quote, those Englishmen who were so tender over constitutional rights that Ireland needed coercion in order to defend propertied civilization. And these would remain the kind of touchstone assumptions of the British government, indeed also US courts and federal agencies in dealing with boycotting. Even though the government tabulated the practice under the heading outrages against public peace, the practice was really seen as a direct attack on property itself, and more broadly on the concept of civilization which it supported. Letters to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland from landowners and agents complain most of all about how the practice risked the value of financial assets. One example from a Reverend Hicks was typical. He wrote in 1885 to Lord Carnarvon, will you allow me as a Conservative and an Englishman, and also as an owner of property in the county of Cork, to ask your lordship whether under the evidently increasing system of boycotting, an extension of the influence of the Irish National League, for the purpose of preventing the letting and taking of evicted farms, the government proposed to do anything for the protection of both landlords and tenants with the object of checking the spread of this system, which must end in preventing the collection of rent, the letting of farms, and in further destroying the little remaining value in the property of land. The Lord Lieutenant agreed. He released a circular saying, His Excellency cannot too strongly point out that boycotting, sanctioned as it has been in too many instances, is in itself an outrage of a serious character, causing not only serious inconvenience, but also injury to the property of the individual boycotted. It was in most instances then threats to property rather than life that marked boycotting. And despite public announcements to the contrary, as one RIC report noted, although boycotting was extremely prevalent in the district, quote, there is no report that any person suffered privation from want of the necessities of life. Government concern about the practice was, however, palpable. Agrarian crimes such as assault and murder were comparatively straightforward to prosecute, albeit with the added challenge of sympathetic juries. Boycotting was, however, as one private memo explained, the real danger. In an attempt to understand and to eliminate the practice, the government not only collected lists of boycotted persons and the reasons for their ostracism, but compiled specimen cases to demonstrate the extent and the severity of the punishment. One example will suffice to show both the temporal length of many boycotts, as well as how deeply woven they could be into the fabric of local life. In July 1884, William Griffin took possession of a farm in Gurramore near New Palace in Limerick. The former tenant, Tim Burke, had been evicted 4 years previously in 1880 for the non-payment of rent. Local hostility towards Burke was immediately palpable. In early November, the local curate spoke to his congregation about the land grabber, noting that Griffin's contribution to the church's annual subscription had been returned to him. He was soon unable to get supplies in the town and had to travel to Limerick itself. He was even shunned by his own friends, and his children were kept apart from others at school. One Sunday, as William Griffin entered Cappamore Chapel, the entire congregation got up and left. And as a result, the parish priest wrote to Griffin to inform him that he was not allowed to come to church. Given all this, the government found it impossible to sustain a prosecution for this case. That was because, in this instance, and indeed in many others, what the government was successfully prosecuting was simply calls to boycott, rather than the practice itself, which still remained immune. The list of specimen cases collected by the government largely admits this. One case involved a mother and daughter who lost their shop and proceeded to watch the premises and list all those who went in there before handing the list to the local league for publication. In this instance, the Attorney General decided it would be inexpedient to prosecute Mrs. Murphy and her daughter. And indeed, one of the striking things about the government's list of boycotted persons is that in the vast majority of cases, no legal proceedings were initiated at all. Official reports of boycotts were deconstructed into specific instances and then their wider effects. So, for example, in July 1887 in Monaghan, there were 23 individual cases of boycotting known to the district inspector, but these involved a total of 163 people, 5 of whom were constantly under police protection and 5 others who were protected by police patrols. In Mayo, at the same time, boycotting was affecting a total of 320 people, with 11 under police protection. And the divisional magistrate there reported that, quote, the law has entirely broken down in reference to every phase of agrarian crime. It may be asserted with confidence that every offence partaking in the smallest degree of the popular element is openly commended instead of being looked upon as a crime, and the perpetrators are privately and publicly applauded. So far as trial by jury is concerned, it is a mere waste of time and money to send prisoners for trial. In Galway, there were 67 cases of entire and partial boycotting involving 389 individuals, with a total of 33 people under constant police protection, which meant that across the whole of Ireland at the same date in 1887, the government had counted a total of 768 boycotts involving nearly 5,000 people, which involved constant or partial police protection for over 1,000 of them. The power of this practice then derived primarily from the difficulty of securing a prosecution for behaviours that were, at least on an individual level, legal. It also raised the thorny issue of intimidation, what it constituted and how it could be defined. The police assiduously collected evidence of intimidation, but were hamstrung by the nature of what they were trying to find. One district magistrate reported to the Irish office that, quote, the resolutions passed at branch meetings of the League are in nearly every instance done so at committee meetings held in rooms with closed doors into which police are not allowed to enter. This meant that while, quote, information as to their proceedings is freely given and often published, all attempts to obtain evidence have invariably been futile, and no legal case could be made in the district. As another resident magistrate, Clifford Lloyd, explained, even the coercion acts were limited in their utility in preventing boycotting. And as he later described, in his experience, the only effective way to deal with the practice was to lock up suspects immediately and without investigation at all. As he explained, the RIC had practically no investigatory capabilities outside of Dublin. And once the suspects had dispersed, it was invariably difficult to apprehend them anyway. And the Land League fully understood the difficulties presented to the government by boycotting, as well as the opportunities it afforded them. Debates began immediately after the events at Ballinrobe of Captain Boycott's boycott about whether this new power could be met by the administration of ordinary law or whether it might defy even the most stringent coercive measures. The problem for the government, as the Land League understood, was that it was, quote, not in the power of all the forces of British arms to make a labourer work for the man he does not like or to put down his money on the counter of a man with whom he does not choose to deal. Jurists were well aware that the freedom of action to boycott each other, to cease to associate with people whom we do not like for any reason, still remains central to any conception of individual liberty. So attempts had to be made to prosecute those who called for or orchestrated boycotts. Yet early attempts to do this tended to founder on the problem of free expression. It was not unambiguously illegal to declare that someone should be ostracized. So prosecutors needed to prove that it was part of an organized and clandestine conspiracy to inflict damage, or that some species of intimidation was involved. Now, the government solution was often simply to assume intimidation was involved because they could not directly find evidence. And the argument was that those who were intimidated would not say so. Right from Boycott's boycott, the assumption of Lord Erne was that his tenants were being intimidated by the League and would not admit it. There was a series of letters exchanged between the aristocrat and his tenants. And eventually they wrote to him in early October 1880 saying, "We beg to assure your lordship that we are not following the advice of anyone or any organization. We are simply acting in self-defense and for the very existence of ourselves and our families. And if your agent is compelled to seek police protection in his obnoxious career, he may thank his own conduct, not alone towards us, but towards everyone with whom he has had any dealings, for finding himself in such a disreputable position." Indeed, although the League branches were usually the prime movers in instigating and maintaining boycotts, these organizations could not be easily distinguished from the sentiments of the wider community. In addition, there were also cases where the League declined to proclaim an individual obnoxious, but such persons found themselves boycotted by the community anyway. So for instance, in 1882, a Miss E. Fleming of Kildare evicted 2 tenants for non-payment of rent. The local Land League court declared that the evictions were deserved and refused to instigate a boycott, but Miss Fleming was boycotted anyway. Again, although the police knew of all the particulars of the incidents, including the names of the key observers involved in relaying information and keeping tabs of social interactions, the local district inspector noted that he could not find, quote, that they did any overt act to prevent, well, them buying Miss Fleming's hay. That was the particular instance, but that would have been unnecessary. So prosecutions brought on the basis of constructive conspiracy therefore relied on there being some sort of evidenced form of intimidation. Debates around this centered on the 1875 Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act. So this act had attempted to define intimidation in clear empirical terms, such as detailing what would actually constitute compelling someone else to do something, such as it listed, for instance, persistent following, hiding tools or clothes, watching or besetting their house, or following them with 2 or more persons over a specific distance. And Dublin Castle believed that the 1875 Act offered sufficient protection under this clause to secure prosecutions. And local officers were issued in January 1881 by the RIC office with a circular containing information on how to issue arrest warrants and summons for boycotting. In order to save time, it noted, all prosecutions for the offence in question are to be instituted without seeking instructions from headquarters, when the offence comes unmistakably under the provisions of the Act, and it was accompanied by a copy of Section 7 of that Act. Indeed, up to the passing of the 1882 Coercion Act, there were 320 attempts to prosecute boycotting under the 1875 Act, and some were successful. Yet private correspondence reveals governmental alarm at the inadequacy of this Act to prevent boycotting. So one landlord wrote from Mallow to the Lord Lieutenant that, quote, "the ordinary law, if firmly administered, is sufficient to keep the country quiet, except as to boycotting." Another expressed concern about, quote, the powerlessness of the law as at present administered to deal with boycotting. And Lord Carnarvon, replying and writing in his capacity as Lord Lieutenant, was candid in his responses to these inquiries, saying that, quote, all who understand and watch this problem must be aware how many of its most serious operations are latent and invidious, and how difficult it is to obtain the necessary evidence by which the practice might be legally checked. The problems with prosecution under the 1875 Act were evident before the end of 1880 in the trial of several prominent Land League leaders. The prosecutions were sought on the basis of constructive conspiracy, that the public expressions of Parnell, Michael Davitt, John Dillon and others were evidence of an organised conspiracy to, in the words of the Irish Attorney General Hugh Law, quote, establish red republicanism and communism in Ireland. The prosecution held that the act of combining, quote, to effect civil injury was criminal, even if the acts done themselves were not illegal, a claim which prompted the Washington Post, observing from a distance, to declare that the Irish Attorney General had spread, quote, the meshes of the law wide enough to catch almost any man who had said anything against high rents. So what he was trying to prove, and failed to prove, was that similar phrases on public platforms were definitive proof of a malicious conspiracy done in private. And while he failed to do that, the defendants used the opportunity to attack British rule in Ireland in the name of what they called an authentic liberalism. So, for instance, on the stand, Timothy Sullivan declared the prosecution an act of great apostasy for those who have been brought up to admire liberal principles, asking the jury whether they would, quote, strike a blow at freedom of speech and at the sacred right of public meeting, simply to help the government defeat the League. It was in the end a successful tactic, and the trial ended with an effective acquittal of the defendants. Indeed, the 1875 Act itself provided significant protection from boycotting, and the Land League leaders relied heavily on it in their defence. So the Act had actually legalised, albeit in narrow terms, trade union activity such as picketing that had previously been dealt with as common law conspiracy. Crucially, the Act declared that, quote, an agreement or combination by two or more persons to do or to procure to be done any act in contemplation or furtherance of a trade dispute shall not be indictable as a conspiracy if such acts committed by one person would not be punishable as a crime. So the Irish leaders utilised this when they were on the stand, reminding the government that, quote, what a man might do of himself, he might do in combination with other men and persuade any number of other men to do in combination with him. So as such, when it came to boycotting, the question of intimidation remained paramount, and debates over the term dominated parliamentary discussion over the 1881 Coercion Bill, officially known as the Protection of Persons and Property Act. The broad conception of the word, complained Irish members, in which an act of intimidation might be performed without a single movement of the body, would leave the population subject to the official malevolence of the state. These arguments continued in the House of Commons over the next coercion bill, the 1882 Crimes Act, described by Timothy Sullivan as, quote, the most severe and drastic measure which has been proposed for Ireland since the date of the penal laws. Most of the discussion, 3 whole days of the discussion in the House of Commons, focused solely on the knotty subject of the definition of intimidation. Timothy Healy, the Nationalist MP, sought an amendment to ensure that any prosecutions will be based on actual allegations of intimidation. And that was a proposal rejected by the Home Secretary, William Harcourt, on the grounds that, quote, the people intimidated dare not complain. Even testimony from tenants signed by the local priest stating that no intimidation had been exercised would be insufficient to refute the government's belief that intimidation had occurred. As another pointed out, the fact that intimidation is so protean in its shape that it's impossible to define it. These discussions reveal not only the inability of the government to prescribe the crime of boycotting through intimidation, but also to conceptualize the practice within a liberal framework of free, rational individuals. And free, rational individuals constituted the subjects, the basis for most legislative assumptions, and that was the real challenge that the government was facing. So although there was a decline in agrarian violence, the bill was actually largely unsuccessful in stopping boycotting, with the practice still maintained with implacable rigour into the mid-1880s. Lord Salisbury had also noticed that, quote, the provisions in the Crimes Act against boycotting were of very small effect. This was mainly because, by this point, boycotting was very much ensconced in popular consciousness and in the political life in Ireland. As the Lord Lieutenant added, quote, the Crimes Act did not prevent it and would not make any material difference in reenacted if reenacted, since the League had already passed far beyond the limits of that act. Given that successful prosecutions often required direct evidence of calls to boycott or clear intimidation, the government was involved, as it was keenly aware, in a kind of linguistic game with Landleaguers. So the 1882 Act specified that intimidation included, quote, any word spoken or act done in order to and calculated to put any person in fear of injury or loss of property, business, or means of living. But this still only covered explicit calls to boycott. The first prosecution under the 1882 Coercion Act for boycotting was of James Haw of Tremaine, who was in prison for 14 days hard labour for intimidatory language, for announcing at a public meeting that, quote, any man working for boycotts or boycotted farms should be expelled from all system of society. So as the Irish Office observed, the key result of the 1882 Coercion Act was to make speakers just more careful in their advocacy of boycotting. They quite correctly noted in a memo that the Land League, and then subsequently the National League, had now less need to be explicit in any case. And they believed that statements such as the instruction by Michael Davitt at Tipperary in May of 1884 to, quote, keep a watchful and jealous eye upon land grabbing counted as incitement to intimidate, even if it could not be, and indeed in that case was not, prosecuted. It was, however, a very thin line to walk. In a speech of August of 1884, Davitt again chose his words carefully, but he encouraged those seeking land to, quote, preserve the peace of this part of Ireland and to be responsible to the public sentiment of its people. I will say no more. Instances like this, as the government, as much as the listening audience were also well aware, constituted an encouragement to boycott, but not one that could be prosecuted. One Offaly priest said at a meeting that same year, quote, there is no use in telling you how a land grabber should be treated, as you all know that, before looking over at the police and adding, I believe it would not be safe to tell you, but I believe there is no law to compel you to speak to a man, nor is there any law to make you deal with a man. And since there had never been any easy way for the government to prove in law that people were intimidated rather than simply persuaded to ostracize, even the Coercion Acts were toothless on this point of law. The fact is that the most prosecutions were only achieved by a refusal on the part of the magistrate to distinguish between the act of refusing to deal and the act of coercing others to do so. Indeed, these subtle conflations had always been necessary to prosecute boycotting, as one remarkably revealing Dublin Castle memo on evidence in conspiracy cases made clear. It attacked a recent appeals judgment that, quote, the evidence given in the Killea conspiracy case was insufficient to support a conviction, adding that the logic of the decision, quote, entirely upsets the opinion of the law advisors of the government and the unanimous decisions of all county court judges before whom appeals from convictions have been heard. It continued, the evidence which in general has been relied upon by the police in prosecutions for criminal conspiracy has been of this nature, i.e., that is to say, essentially circumstantial. In discussing the case, the memo adds, it is proved that a number of persons simultaneously do acts, such as refuse to work for, refuse to hire cars, refuse to supply provisions to the boycotted person or persons. And hitherto, it has been held that all these simultaneous actions of all these people was legal evidence that they were mutually engaged in compelling or inducing each other or other unknown persons in the conspiracy to boycott the individual referred to. And here was the knot of the problem. Previous cases had considered the act of refusing to deal as itself evidence of the refusers themselves having been both the intimidators and the intimidated. They were, as the memo notes, mutually engaged in compelling or inducing each other. And the memo then goes on to complain that if such a decision was to set legal precedent, only those persons of whom it could be directly proven that they exercised intimidation would be able to be prosecuted. Now, this was, as many opponents noted, a remarkable twisting of the law, and one which essentially denied any possibility of individual or collective agency in matters of social or economic interaction. Speaking on the matter to the London Liberal and Radical Union in 1888, Liberal MP John Morley was aghast at the various coercion acts and the way that they were utilised in this regard. Just as nationalists had warned in 1881, it was widely open to abuse by policemen. So, for instance, in one case, several farmers were convicted of conspiracy to induce persons not to sell turf to the constabulary. But it turned out that one constable on cross-examination admitted that he went out at 4 o'clock in the morning to ask people on their way to Ennis to sell turf. and he admitted they did not require it at the police barracks, having had a sufficient quantity, and that this was for the purpose of getting up a prosecution. Yet the logic on the part of the British government was clear. To submit to the idea that such actions were free and rational would be to relinquish any governmental authority over Ireland. It had to be, as Gladstone argued in 1881, that the Land League was, quote, an organised attempt to override the free will and judgment of the Irish nation. In private, however, Gladstone, like many others in the British political establishment, were more explicit about their opinion that it was simply evidence the Irish were unfit for self-government. As he wrote to the Queen, the acceptance of the authority of the Land League in and of itself showed, quote, how far the better part of the Irish people are from yet having attained to the habits of a free and self-reliant community. And as Gladstone worried, quote, such habits cannot be implanted by laws, nor can the lack of them be supplied by the action of the state. Both the idea that Irish people were intimidated into boycotting and that they accepted it willingly because of their incapacity for self-government were arguments that were used to work around the central problem of boycotting for those notionally committed to ideas of liberal democracy. The Land League had assumed the role of a de facto state, with broadly speaking the popular consent of the majority. Even its most vituperative critics noted that its committees were, quote, constituting themselves in every village of any size and assuming to themselves many of the functions of a lawful government, such as holding courts for trial in cases connected with land and disobedience to the general rules of the organisation or non-compliance with its local edicts. It has generally usurped the functions of the Crown. As one land agent complained, boycotting was never carried out to such an extent at present, and it's impossible to live if you go against the people. This kind of rough democracy was evident even through critical police reports. One sergeant noted that, quote, the two worst cases of boycotting in the area are Miss Maroney's and Colonel O'Callaghan's, and I must say that I think they have unnecessarily brought a great deal of it on themselves by their hard, relentless way of dealing with the people. Others noted as extraordinary the much greater awe that the population held the authority of the League, quote, than they do the established authority of the country. Specific cases also show that the authority of the League, and of course the effectiveness of boycotting, was completely contingent on this kind of degree of local support. One such example includes the case of John Hulster, who, having returned from America with some money, took a farm in Cashel, and after being subsequently hooted and jeered at as a grabber, wrote to the parish priest asking to be allowed to hold the farm for the half year for which he had already paid, and agreeing to give it up subsequently. According to the police report, quote, Father Delaney held up the letter at chapel on the 19th of December, 1886, and told the congregation of its purpose and asked if Hulster's request should be granted. They decided it should not be granted, and then it was agreed to hold a public meeting about the case. Altogether then, this anarchic aspect to boycotting forced Liberal politicians to embrace more fully the power and authority of the state, rather than relying on the slippery and, as boycotting itself showed, often dangerously unstable notions of individual freedom or liberty. If boycotting threatened to usurp the authority of the state, it also, as a consequence, endangered the power of the state to secure peace, order, and the security of property, which were as much concerns of social liberals as they were for conservative politicians. It seems clear that the prominence of boycotting in the early 1880s especially helped to both develop and deepen the political importance of social liberal thinking in this regard, since only this approach could coherently confront this kind of free rationality issue that it raised. But this came at the expense of notions of participatory democracy, which were, of course, inevitably undermined by such thinking. Later New Liberals would argue that the forces of social disapproval, since largely inevitable, should instead be harnessed and controlled by the government for positive ends. In his notorious celebration of individual freedom, written in the mid-19th century, On Liberty, John Stuart Mill had accepted the important function of social disapproval in the form of, quote, avoidance by other people, and even the moral force, quote, which the general public asserts over the people in general. Yet, confronted with the radical power and the far-reaching implications of boycotting, few late Victorian era liberals could comfortably adhere to what seemed to be quite naive assumptions now about individual freedom. Boycotting showed how freely taken individual actions might entirely undermine the authority and power of the state. As one jurist argued in 1886, boycotting was, quote, a usurpation of the functions of government that should be recognized in their true light as acts of social war, as the modern representatives of the old conception of high treason. Even John Morley, the Liberal statesman, attacking the misuses of the coercion bill, was open to the possibility that legal restrictions on, quote, exclusive dealing may be necessary in the future in any case. So boycotting was reliant on the notion that individuals possessed a pre-existing right to disengage with or to ostracize others. But at the same time, it proved that such choices could never be taken without social influence, that all people were, as the nationalist MP Alexander Sullivan explained in the House of Commons, subject to, quote, the boycotting of the age in which they lived. So just as the legal challenge to boycotting was never successfully solved or settled in the courts, in political terms, it also required Liberals to jettison many familiar and traditional ideas about freedom and liberty. Thank you very much. That's me finished. I guess we move over to questions now. Is that right, John?
Yes, I'm back. Yes. So thanks very much for that very interesting and wide-ranging discussion of boycotting and the efforts to respond to it by those in authority. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions. I can see already that we've got something here. Yeah, this is from Jay Rosman, who sends you his greetings as well.
Oh, yes. Hi, Jay.
Indeed. So Jay's question is quite a long one, so please bear with me. Two questions. First, curious about the costs of boycotting. Was it passed on to local districts via special legislation or footed by the government? Second, a question about continuity across the century. What are the differences between boycotting and earlier outrages, like so-called combinations? Is it simply a matter of scale, or is it the active participation of a far wider public, which would include their unwillingness to prosecute or to find people guilty, if impanelled on a jury, versus a more passive, intimidated pre-famine population, quieted into submission of so-called white boy violence? So, two parts to the question there.
Okay, thanks for those questions, Jay. They're very good, interesting questions that I can't offer too much. What I will say is that, at least in the first instance, the cost of boycotting was footed by the government. I know this because the army was drafted in on several occasions, in fact, quite frequently. And I know that Gladstone received letters asking for more to be done and was rather frustrated with the fact that the government was paying so much money to protect various people and to protect crops being brought up and such like. So it was a significant cost of the government, and it was also one in which the Land League was very aware that it was a victory by in and of itself costing the government money. That was part of the objective of boycotting in many instances. And the second question, the difference between boycotting and earlier outrages like combination. Well, scale is a key one. I mean, I think that's what I was trying to get at with the Bence Jones example, that it could be spread so easily. I suppose newspapers are really key in this, as well as local knowledge. It's really passing knowledge into different areas and making sure that a wider public are sympathetic and alive to who is boycotted. That being said, one of the interesting things about specific cases of boycotting is how much they vary. So there's, Bence Jones's case is one that's international, but there's also plenty where people are boycotted in very, very local contexts and find it quite easy to procure what they need from, say, the next town or something like that. And I think that's what the government is getting at when they're listing cases of total boycotting and partial boycotting. How that links up to what the specific crime is, as it were, I don't know, and that would need to be investigated. But that's a very interesting difference in terms of the matter of scale. And yes, the unwillingness to prosecute, I mean, that was a key concern of the government through all the coercion acts, of course, was that it was almost impossible to find a jury that they considered would be unbiased and impartial. And that was part of the problem in the initial state trials in 1880, was that I think the government was a little shocked that the jury dismissed the case. So yeah, hopefully that answers some of that question. Right.
Thanks. I have a question from Dan Carey now. I think, Dan, can you switch on your camera and ask it face to face, as it were?
Thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, really great to see this research developing. I thought I would just a couple of things unrelated, two questions unrelated to one another. But first, sort of a shout out to the Journal of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society, which published a piece by Jared Moran in 1985-86 on the origins and development of boycotting. So as friends of Jared would wish to have that mentioned, and the journal should be recognized for an early contribution on the topic. The two things that I want to ask about, one was with Bence Jones. Was there anything about his legal background that might have suggested that he could use legal provisions to prevent this from succeeding? The other unrelated question is not really based in Ireland, but I'm just wondering whether boycotting was used as a technique in less congenial circumstances against minority groups. I was thinking of Jewish merchants, for example, in particular, and whether it was used perhaps in a less attractive way as a form of retribution, perhaps in that context.
Yeah, so on the second point first, I mean, it was certainly the opinion of local constabulary that in many cases, boycotting was essentially local disputes, people who held social power in specific areas, using them to kind of further grudges and to kind of instigate their own power, really, that this wasn't kind of a wider social issue. How far that is widespread, I don't know. It's certainly something that occurred. And there was also reports of instances of sectarian boycotting as well. And that's something that is more frequent later on, certainly. But at the beginning, even, there are instances that reported of that. So that's certainly true. As for Bence Jones's legal background, one of the things that's striking about his book is how unlegalistic it is. So I don't know if maybe he'd forgotten all his legal training or he wasn't that interested in it, but he was more apoplectic, really, about the fact that he couldn't sell his cows and that property didn't have any value anymore. He didn't offer any specific, shall we say, kind of legal prescriptions beyond the fact that he thought the government and the army should be heavily involved in forcing people to do what they did before. Basically, that was that's how he was frustrated. So yeah, that's a good point. It would have been nice if he'd thought more deeply about it. There were jurists that thought very deeply about it. But they tended to be conservative ones who thought that this was a social issue that should be solved by the government, basically. And like I was mentioning, the idea that this was an act of social war. I mean, that was a very common refrain, that it was treasonable. That was essentially the issue, that it was an attempt to usurp the functions of government, and therefore, in terms of prosecution, it should be prosecuted as a form of treason. But it didn't really get around the problem of individuals and intimidation. I mean, that was the issue that the government faced, was that they had to conflate those two, individuals choosing not to do something versus individuals intimidating other people. So, yeah.
Thanks. I guess there's certain simplicity in Bence Jones's position then.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks very much. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan. I know you have a cold,
Sorry,
Andrew, but the questions are coming thick and fast now, so I hope you're able to take a few more. There's greetings, by the way, from Liam Shortall, who's found the presentation very interesting. I've got a question next, taking them in order, from Liam Alex Heffron. Thanks, Andrew, very interesting. How did boycotting evolve as the state attempted to suppress it?
So, well, I mean, one of the things, as I mentioned there, is that there's fewer explicit calls to boycott. I mean, I think that's key, is that it has to be more clandestine once the coercion acts are in place. And once I mean, certainly the Irish office believes that, once I think the 1882 Act expires in 1885, and so for the 2 years before the next coercion act, there are more explicit calls to boycotting again. So it modifies with what the police will accept, basically. And the Land League is quite alive to that. And certainly, I think the change in boycotting is that it becomes more organized. It becomes more officious, basically, and organized through courts. And the Planner campaign is a good example of that. I think that, and the government was aware as well, that this was kind of a more legalistic framework through which to view boycotting, and probably less of the local areas doing it themselves, sort of thing. And also it changes internationally as well, because of the effect of boycotting in the US, where there's a whole other set of legal challenges that accompany it. And again, I would say it becomes more formalized and more legalistic. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Andrew. We'll move on. Have another question from Donal O'Kelly. Hello, Donal. The change that happened in the short time between Ennis and Ballinrobe, when ostracization was changed to boycott, the target was changed, not just the term, from blacklegs to agents and landlords. Is there any evidence that you know of where the move originated? I don't believe the Redpath Father O'Malley accepted version. Are there other theories of an organised attempt to steer the Land League in a more radical direction?
The target was changed, and that was a key difference. However, very quickly, it's land grabbers again who were not just agents and landlords, who were subject to boycotting. So, that is what attracts the attention, and the sort of the way the term gains prominence, certainly, is this shift towards agents and landlords. But very quickly, or perhaps almost immediately, it's also applied to those who take evicted farms. So it's still the same in that sense. It's still those people who are being boycotted. As to where the Redpath O'Malley, who defined the term itself, boycotting? No, I don't particularly believe the Redpath version either, because he's such a kind of a bombastic kind of writer in his talks about Ireland. But in terms of how the term originated, I'm not too sure that there's any other known explanation beyond that put forward by Redpath. But I do know quite a lot about the way the term was used so malleably in the first kind of few weeks and months after the boycott affair. And it's interesting how it was all conjugated differently as well as boycottism. And that was something that was embraced by the League, that boycotting was not just a practice, but like it was its own social theory, its own kind of way of dealing with its own system of government in and of itself, rather than a practice. And organised attempts to steer the Land League in a more radical direction. I mean, there were a great many of them, I suppose. There was Davitt was explicitly trying to do that, and Henry George was explicitly trying to do that all the time, pretty much. So it was a constant battle to steer the Land League in a more radical direction, I guess. Right.
Yeah, there are more questions. I'll jump in and ask one now myself. You mentioned the international element. Tantalizingly, there are a few references in the talk and just now to the United States and the use by labour movements there. Can you say a little bit more about the response in the States to the use of boycotting, or to the adoption of, or adaptation of boycotting, I suppose, but by labour bodies there?
Well, I mean, the response was kind of in some ways similar, in some ways different. So obviously, legally it faced the same particular issues about intimidation, but there was greater freedom in the US for courts to define the issue, rather than it being a kind of legislative one that the federal government or even state governments until probably the middle of the 1880s took much interest in. But it was still a politically salient issue straight away. And the Knights of Labour are obviously key to understanding how it transmitted directly. And as I was alluding to in the paper, that happened very quickly. And responses in the US were, as you would expect them, an Anglo-American elite pretty much said, well, this is kind of the uncivilized Irish and they can't help themselves. And that very easily transmuted into kind of, well, all working class people don't really know how to hold political power. Look at what they're doing. So boycotting fed into that very strongly. Yeah, the courts were somewhat successful in prosecuting boycotting as a conspiracy in the US, but only because they had more leeway, as it were, and judges had more leeway than they did in the UK. So,
what did Henry George think of boycotting? As I know you're Henry George.
He was a fan of it, yeah. But I wouldn't say. I mean, I think like Parnell, Henry George was of the opinion that boycotting was a socially valuable thing in certain contexts. But I think, like most liberals, was actually deeply worried that, adopted wholesale, like many anarchists suggested, that it would be terrifying and that all systems of government would ultimately crumble, which is, of course, what the anarchists wanted. But, Parnell said, in 1882, I kind of, regret what I said, and Ennis, and, it wouldn't be advisable in a properly self-governed country and all the rest of it, So there's a rowing back from that once there's a recognition of just how out of hand it could get, I suppose. And I'd put Henry George in that category as well, fortunately.
Thanks. There's a question from Daniel Gallen. Hello, Daniel. Mm-hmm. Really interesting, Andrew. Thanks so much. You mentioned that in some cases boycotts were undertaken independently of Land League instruction. What was the response of the League in such cases? Could they realistically do anything to stop these? Did letting them continue do anything to subvert or diminish their authority? Basically, what was stopping these unsanctioned boycotts from simply getting out of control?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to specifically, did they diminish their authority? I mean, it would seem that they didn't diminish their authority. What I would say is there's probably quite a lot of reflexive interaction between the demands of any particular local community or a large subset or majority of people within that community, and then what the Land League decides to do. And this is kind of what I was getting at. I think it's the essence of the question is and this goes back to an earlier one as well, about how much kind of individuals within local communities are able to override what are, generally widely held sentiments. And I think boycotting does kind of limit that. So I don't know. I don't think there were that many cases in which the Land League instructions were not followed, but I think that's largely because the Land League was aware that, just like for priests and just like for other forms of social authority, that their control over people, so much as it was contingent anyway on loosely a form of consent. So I doubt that diminished their authority particularly. Yeah.
So it was interesting what you said there about essentially priests conducting ballots from the altar.
And one of the things that, I know this is widely known anyway, but one of the things that really comes out to me reading all the police reports about boycotting and the concerns of the Irish office and everything like that is the degree to which they're aware and are very concerned about the fact that priests are the kind of guiding spirit of most Land League branches and of most boycotts, or at least they believe that to be the case, that in the vast majority of cases, priests are kind of central to this whole thing. And indeed, in a kind of like administrative role, of course, as well, like when people are boycotted and they feel they've been unfairly boycotted, often they will go to the priest to kind of mediate, even if the priest isn't the Land League organizer in that locality, they will go to the priest to mediate between them anyway. So that is a particularly interesting aspect of this. And of course, a result of that was that many critics saw a close connection between boycotting and Catholic excommunication. So they believed that boycotting was itself taken from Catholic theology and applied directly to politics, which is, of course, a natural assumption for the British government to make, I guess.
Okay. We have one more question here. This is from Eamon Phelan. Eamon is interested in England, specifically wondering if there was a greater level of prosecution there when it was deployed in England?
The short answer is not in the immediate aftermath, and not specifically to do with Irish instances. So when they're discussing, thinking about the later analysis of boycotting by some political thinkers, I know that they were of the opinion that the reason why boycotting didn't require legal sanction in England was largely because there were other kind of social means to check the evil. I think that was one of the quotes. And particularly, I think this is because it's much harder to boycott in urban environments rather than in smaller rural locales. And of course, as well, it wasn't adopted wholesale by any... the Knights of Labour were rather weak in Britain, and it wasn't adopted wholesale by any labour movements, at least as far as I'm aware. So it didn't really have the same impact or necessity to prosecute, I think, in England.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And thanks again from Donal O'Kelly there. I think we can wrap it up there. You've fielded a large number of questions, I think, in the last 20 minutes or so, and very enthusiastic response from our people out there in Zoom land. And great to see such a big crowd at the event tonight. So thanks again to Andrew. Thanks to the, on behalf of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society, I'd like to thank the Moore Institute for facilitating us again in giving us the platform to put this out there. So we'll be alerting our members to future lectures in the very near future. So with that, good night